Jerry? Jerry was standing in the back doorway looking to see if I was talking and he couldn't hear me. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 5 this evening. Joshua chapter 5. Figure out where I put my notes in my Bible. Here we go. All right. That's better. Joshua chapter 5, we have a bit of preparation to take place right before their attack on Jericho, what we're all very much so probably familiar with. And in this chapter, as I said, we see a bit of preparation that's taking place in the ways that the first verse really identifies a way that the Lord was preparing the enemies against Israel. And then we continue on and we see the Lord having the people to be circumcised, to prepare themselves, and really through this, what we're seeing is their willingness to follow the Lord, to trust in Him. And then in the second half of the chapter, it then begets to Israel observing the Passover beforehand. And then the final part of it, we have the Lord paying a visit to Joshua and giving him another round of encouragement, we could say. And then that goes into the next chapter, which we have the Lord giving Joshua instructions on their way to go in it. We're not going to get into the next chapter tonight, but we will see when the Lord arrives here. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started with this. Lord, I'm thankful that we're able to be here this evening. I'm so thankful for your many blessings upon us, the ways that you've worked in our lives, and just the way that you've worked in this church, Lord. But I pray that right now, as we're studying your word, you'd help us to understand it, that you'd help us to listen attentively to it, and that we can learn from it, Lord, that we can grow as a result of it, Lord. I'd pray that you would guide and direct me as I teach your word, and everything ultimately would be for your honor, your glory, and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. When we begin here, we see is what I'd like to call is the Lord preparing the enemies of Israel. We see chapter 5, it says, "And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel until we were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was there any more spirit in them anymore, because of the children of Israel." Now, last week when we were, not last week, the week before last, I wasn't here last week, but the last lesson that we did in Joshua, one of the things that I mentioned multiple times is that from the events, when they crossed the it happened when they crossed the Red Sea too, but when they crossed the Jordan, that I said this is going to have an effect on those around, because one of the things to talk about is that what the Lord did was He didn't just create a magical trench for them to flow through. He literally stopped the rivers of the Jordan, and it began basically just damming up and continuing to not fall. And it was during the flooding season. And so it was dammed up and it stopped. So everything downstream dried up, and everything upstream began to flood even more. And one of the things I mentioned is that because of this and the extent of it and the time of this being, this was not something that was contained to just where Israel was crossing the Jordan. This is something that would have probably had the effect of many other cities upstream would have noticed the difference. Many cities downstream would have noticed the difference. And people would begin talking about this. And so it didn't really necessarily need for there to be somebody present to watch Israel crossing the Jordan River, because they see this happen, and then they already know about Israel crossing the Red Sea, as Rahab told us. And so you can kind of put things together, and they may have had somebody, but this was something that was spread out across many other cities and groups of people along Jordan. And so we're told here that all of these kings and all of the people that were on the west side of Jordan and those up by the sea, which is the promised land, which Rahab told us they knew that that was the land that was promised to them. They knew that Israel was coming to take the land that God had promised to them. So when they heard about what had happened at the Jordan, when they crossed the Red Sea, and then it just magically dammed up, and then as soon as they crossed, it started going again, well, you can imagine the response that they would have. And we're told that their hearts melted. You know, morale is a very big deal in the battlefield. And when you lose morale, you lose your, and morale really has an effect in a lot of different ways. When you lose it, it really hinders your effectiveness. But on the battlefield, it's a very big thing because then you have people that are more likely to just run. You have deserters. Nobody's excited and putting in all their effort to attack. And so what we're seeing here is that the Lord is using this opportunity, which is a very convenient way for Israel to cross the Jordan. He's also using this as an opportunity to prepare those that Israel's going to be doing battle with to make it to where it's an easier battle for them, to hinder the people. And I always like to look in Scripture and see these things that the Lord does, where you see these parts where He's thinking in a much grander scale than just right here in front of you. He's having an effect in all these different areas, in many areas that we don't even realize. And that's what He was doing here for Israel. And so God has, with this miracle, this ability, He's already weakened the people that they're going against. Some that when Israel came the first time, they said, there's no way we can defeat them. They're giants. They're too strong. There's no way we're going to do this. We might as well just go back to Egypt. It's the same people. And see that their spirit is gone. They have no strength emotionally anymore. And they look at it as the children of Israel say, we've no hope against them. Let's just run now. Yeah, this is amazing. Because we're in comparing the two times when Israel first came to the Promised Land and now, is a completely different set of events. Israel's having all of these amazing things happen to them, and there's being all these ways that they're being blessed, and they're getting to see the hand of the Lord. And the other time, they got punished by God. They got taken back into the wilderness for 40 years. And then there's all these other things that they weren't even able, well, it's an amazing thing that the Lord provided the manna for them all this time. It would have been much better to be living in the Promised Land, right? It's just an amazing comparison. And really, this is something that I always try to remind myself, and we need to remember. The number one way that the Lord works in our life is by us following His will. If you don't follow His will, He can't help you. He can't bless you. Because you're outside of His will. But when you're in God's will, when you're committed to Him, when you're going after Him, then you have all these opportunities for Him to do these amazing things. And it's all because you made the choice to follow. We continue, the Lord doesn't just work on the enemies, but also He has some things that Israel needs to be doing and preparing before going in. We continue now into verse 2. It says, "And at that time the Lord said unto Joshua, Make thee sharp knives, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. And Joshua made him sharp knives, and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins." We have here that the Lord commands the people to be circumcised, and we see that Joshua and the people of Israel, they continue with this, and it says here the second time, and as we're going to go in this, it's going to explain what is meant here. It's not saying that those that were circumcised before are being recircumcised again here. What he's going to explain for us is that there are many that were not circumcised because it had stopped while they're in the wilderness. So let's go ahead and read that, and we'll look at verse 4 through 6. It says, "And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way after they came out of Egypt. Now all the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way as they came forth out of Egypt. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people that came, which came out of Egypt, were consumed. Because they obeyed not the Lord, or because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord sware that He would not show them the land which the Lord sware unto their fathers, that He would give us a land that floweth with milk and honey." So he explains us here that the reason for having to do this again is that while wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, they had, for some reason, stopped circumcising. They had not continued with it while they were in the wilderness. And so what had happened is that there were many that weren't circumcised here. And one of the things I do want to talk about here before we continue with this is that when it's talking about those dying off in the wilderness, it's talking here about the men of war. And when you look at the original prophecy and thing, it was everybody over 20 was going to die. The focus here is people being circumcised. Well, it's only the males that are circumcised. And in this case, all the males would be men of war as adults. It would have been the men of war and these things. So the focus is on those being circumcised. That's why it's not saying, we don't have a contradiction here in that it was the men that God was letting die, not all those over 20 or 20 and older here. So when we continue with this, it doesn't really give us a reason as to why they stopped circumcising. There's a lot of theories as to it. Most prominently that I was able to find is just that they were, of the different ones that I looked at, is there's many that basically suppose that because they were wandering in the wilderness and they were constantly moving about and things, that they just kind of didn't do it because of the nomadic part of it, because they're constantly in the movingness. There's other things too that they suppose, some even suppose that God told them to stop while they're in the wilderness, but that doesn't really fit with any of God's commands. We don't see anything He tells us why, but they stopped doing it. It could have just been because they were in the wilderness. This was them being punished because of their disobedience with God, is that they continued being disobedient, which we see that there were those that murmured and complained, and we see problems. They were not perfect while they were in the wilderness. So it could have been that they were just quit because they didn't see the purpose of it anymore, because they weren't going into the promised land, so why do what God told them to do with this? And the circumcision was given to Abraham with this covenant that was made, and it does reference this here with it. But what we see here is that the Lord is preparing them, and He is getting them to be in a place where they need to be as a nation and following Him. And so He's instructing them. We see in verse 7, He says, "And their children, whom He raised up in their stead, them Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them by the way." And so we see that the Lord has them to do this, and we see verse 8, it says, "And it came to pass when they had done circumcising all the people, that they abode in their places in the camp till they were whole. We see that they go and they follow the Lord. They do as they were told and are obedient to Him, and they have their time of healing as well, which would be natural. There would be some healing time for it. But I want you to think about it in this way. You got to remember where they're at. They're in enemy territory right now. They're not in a safe place. And all the men were just circumcised. This is, you think about this in normal physical sense. That's not a strategic move, is it? To compromise all of your men of war at the same time? But it's not a bad choice because they're listening to the Lord. What we're seeing here is for them to do it in this way, and to do it all at once, and to do it at this time, which is what it indicates here, is showing that their willingness as a people to trust the Lord. Which is completely different from those that came before. Because those that came before didn't even trust the Lord to go into the land. They're in the land, and they just compromised all of their men of war. That takes an immense amount of trust. And it shows really the place where they're at in their spirituality. And it shows why they're having, and they're going to continue having the success that they are. Because they are following the Lord as a nation. They have taken the time, and they didn't hold back to follow the Lord's instructions. And this is the thing to remember with this. In all cases, when the Lord has something He needs us to do, something that He tells us to do, even if it seems from a worldly standpoint to be an illogical choice, a choice, something to, most people, if you're just looking at, they probably would have said, well, let's hold off until after we conquer the land to do this. And you know what happened? They would have been putting it off for years and years and years and years to do something that they should have been doing at the beginning. And that's the temptation. Sometimes we say, I'm going to put this off until I complete this. Because it just doesn't make sense for me to do it right now. It's not going to work. And then what happens is we're 10 years down the road and you've never done it. Or there's things that are even on a much shorter scale. We say, I'm going to put it off for a couple of weeks, and then we're a month down the road and we haven't done it. And what we're going to see as we continue on is when Israel doesn't listen to the Lord, they lose. What likely would have happened if they would have said, no, we're not going to do that yet, because it's not a good time for us to do it, what would happen is they would have lost at Jericho. They wouldn't have made it any farther than Jericho. If they even got there, the Lord might have just turned them back around again. They wouldn't have even made it into the promised land. It's important for us to always prioritize God's commandments, even if it doesn't make sense from our fleshly minds. Continue. Verse 9, it says, And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. The word Gilgal means rolled away. And so we see it here being shown that they are a people that are following the Lord. And when the circumcision was first set, it was a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham when it was first set. And Romans chapter 4, Paul actually makes it clear to us and explains it to us in the process of the entire chapter. So we're not going to look there because we'd have to read the whole chapter, and I don't have enough time for that. But Paul makes it very clear that the circumcision was a sign of after Abraham had believed. That it was a testament of Abraham believing. what we have here again is this confirmation. What the Lord's saying is that they are now a people that are following the Lord instead of a people that are distracted by the things that they got in Egypt. What he's showing for them here is they've been really kind of purged. Egypt's been purged out of them because of those that passed away in the wilderness. But the Lord here, He's now renewing this covenant with His people because they are now a people that are following Him. They're now a people that He can bless because they're in His will. Because they're listening to Him. And so the Lord here, as well, is showing these Israelis, saying, hey, I'm with you. You're mine. You're saying that you're mine. I'm saying that you're mine. So we're together and we're going at this together. And I'm going to give you this land. We continue and we see another instance of them following the Lord in enemy territory. We see them, Israel, remembering the works of the Lord in the Passover. They observe it here, verse 10. It says, and the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, even in the plains of Jericho. And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow, after the Passover, unleavened cakes, and parched corn in the selfsame day. And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. We see that while they're encamped in Gilgal, it comes time to observe the Passover. And just like with the circumcision, they observe the Passover like they're supposed to. In this being their first observance of it within the Promised Land. We have here, it's been just a little over 40 years, and now they're here. They were promised the land when they left Egypt, and it is the Lord's planning that has taken them to this point. But we see this as well in verse 12, that we're told here now that the manna has ceased at this point in time, because what has stopped is that they now have the corn, they now have things to eat of from the Promised Land that God's gave them. There's no more this need for the manna because the Lord's providing for them through other ways now. They have the fruit of the land that's given to them. And as I mentioned, this is, again, further evidence of Israel's willingness to trust God, because they're taking time in enemy territory again to worship God. And the Passover would have required a lot of time, would have required a lot of evidence. It's one that everybody has to observe. And they're doing this, as it tells us, in the plains of Jericho. They're close to Jericho at this point. There's, again, the risk for attack. But they're spending their time to worship God. Remember what God has done. And I think the Lord's planning again, very specific planning, because He's reminding them at this point in time, right before they begin, He's reminding them how they got out of Egypt. That it was the Passover lamb that saved them there. It was the Lord that brought them out of Egypt, and so this is the time for them to remember and remind them, hey, the Lord's who you want. But most would have waited on the other side of Jordan to do this. And then crossed the Jordan after the Passover, knowing it's coming up. But the Lord took them over and they followed. We see that they have a priority on the Lord in this. They would be excited to take the land that was right from there. The land was promised to them. The Lord told them, the land's yours. I'm going to give it to you. It's an exciting thing. That's something that probably, I would say all of them are probably very excited to go and to do. The tribes of, it was Reuben and Manasseh, and I forget the other tribe that had was Dan was on the other side of Jordan, right? There were 2.5 tribes that were on the other side of Jordan that just the men came across. I know one of them was Reuben, one of them was the half tribe of Manasseh. But it's just a couple chapters over. Here. Now I'm going to look it up. Chapter 1, verse 12, it says, "And to the Reubenites, to the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh is Gad." Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, their families, their belongings, their everything was on the other side of Jordan. They would have been excited to get the fighting done so that they could go back home to their families. They're separated from their families right now. The rest, they want their homes. And so this would be something that would be very exciting. You'd want to go and you'd want to get started doing it. You'd want to get started going after this. But they stop to do what God has commanded them to do. They stop to circumcise and to worship. Even though it's God's plan for them to take the lamb, God's commandments still stand. We cannot compromise in one area to justify getting a head start on something else. To accomplish something else. Even if it's something that the Lord has told us is going to happen or told us it's something we need to do, we can't compromise. We can't stop doing something else that we're supposed to be doing as well. We can't put off other things that we need to be doing because we're still walking in disobedience. We're not following God. We're not trusting God's plan. You see, they take this time. And we have to remember to take the steps that God has for us in the way that He has given them to us and in the timing that He makes available too. Can't change God's time. They could have said, God's taking us here now. It's time for us to be taking the land. We'll make the Passover wait. The Lord knew the Passover was coming. As I already mentioned, there's probably a lot of reasons for it. And God has reasons for everything He does. There's not mistakes in timing with the Lord. Can't compromise. Can't let something else go, even if it's something that's important. We continue now and we see what I believe to be the Lord visiting Joshua. And let's go ahead and read through it, and then I'll talk about why I think this is the Lord here. I believe it is. When we get into verse 13 through 15, it says, "And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went up to him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the hosts of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place wherein thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so." There's really two main thoughts as to this either being an angel or this being a pre-incarnate Christ. As I mentioned, I believe this to be pre-incarnate Christ, to be the Lord. And the first thing that we see here is that the man identifies himself as the captain of the host of the Lord. And we are told, and I would think when looking at this, that no angel would claim to be the captain or the ruler of the hosts of the Lord. that only the Lord can make this claim, but I do think that there's an even bigger reason here, because when we look in verse 14, that Joshua, upon realizing who it is, falls down and worships him. And this is the biggest indicator, I believe, because whenever you look in Revelation 22, 8, and 9, John has an angel that he comes across. 22, 8, and 9 of Revelation. It says, "And I, John, saw these things and heard them, and when I heard and seen, I fell down and worshipped before the feet of the angel which showed me these things. Then saith he unto me, See thou do it not, for I am thy fellow servant, of thy brethren the prophets, and of them which keep the sayings of this book, worship God." And if this had been indeed being an angel, the first thing the angel would have said is, "Stop worshiping me." Because the Lord alone is who you worship. But we see very clearly here that Joshua worships this man. It falls down on him. It falls down in this. He does not, and the man doesn't correct this. And we see that he continues and makes this even more greater significance, because he tells Joshua that this is a holy place. Remove your sandals, which is the same thing that you probably remember with Moses and the burning bush, when he's speaking to the Lord, that the Lord tells him to remove it. That he's making this even more holy. He's making even more significance for this. He's not downplaying who he is. He's building up who he is. And the only person that could meet is the Lord. Only one is worthy of that. No angel would do this. He's in the presence of God. When we continue, we're not going to look at it today, but in chapter 6, in verse 2, it says that the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given to thine hand Jericho and the king thereof and the mighty men of valor. Then the very next chapter, and remember, chapters are not inspired. They were put in there by men. And so, really, the way that if you read this without our division, you could say this continues in is the same thing here. That this is the same event. And the Lord's the one that's speaking. So what is the purpose of this? Well, of course, as I said, chapter 6, he is given instructions on how they are to go and to take Jericho. And even though I just said that this isn't a division, we're going to divide it because I want to look at the instructions along with the things that take place with Jericho and after, and it's too much for one night. But he's giving these instructions to Joshua on how to take Jericho, which is something that's important, right? But I think another thing is being accomplished here. That when Joshua meets this man, he's going up to Jericho, likely probably scouting it out, and maybe even thinking a little bit on his own about what's getting ready to take place. And we see that this man appears with his sword drawn. We're seeing a man that is ready for battle. And then Joshua finds out this is the Lord. What the Lord's doing here is he's showing him, he's saying, I'm ready to help you with this battle. You have me on your side. Because Joshua even asks, he said, are you with me or are you against me? And the Lord basically tells him, says, I'm with you. I'm the one leading you. I'm the one that's going to give you this victory. We've seen already previously in Joshua that on multiple counts here, the Lord has done things, and He's set things up in a way to prove to Joshua that the Lord's with him, just as the Lord was with Moses. And to prove to the people that the Lord is with Joshua, just as the Lord was with Joshua, that multiple times the Lord has already made points to prove that He's with Joshua. And I think this is, again, another thing the Lord is putting for Joshua to say, hey, I'm with you. I'm helping you. I'm with you just as I was with Moses. These multiple times that the Lord's done this, I think it's safe to say that Joshua was thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. Who am I to be leading God's people? Am I going to do any good at this? And the Lord says, yeah, Because I'm with you. Because you're following me. Because you're doing the things that I've told you to do. So you're going to be successful at this. You're going to lead the people on a good path, just as Moses did. You're going to do things exactly the way that I want because you're following me. And I'm with you. Oh, and we are following the Lord's will, and as we've been looking at all these things constantly, I've been pointing out that there's the importance here that they're trusting the Lord, they're listening to the Lord, they're being obedient to the Lord. When you walk in the Lord's will, the Lord is with you. He's with you. Now, there's a lot of things that we wonder about, a lot of things that we see that could be a hindrance, or things that can stop it or that can slow it down. And here's the thing you just have to remember. No matter what happens, the Lord's with you. And if you walk in His plan, if you do what He says, you follow His commandments, you follow His path, you follow the steps that He sets before you, when and where He places them, He's with you and you have nothing to worry about. You have nothing to be concerned. He's not your adversary. He's your leader. He's with you. Do we have any